They say every man must face his judgment. I always assumed mine would be before a jury of strangers I could easily charm. Instead, I faced it in a federal courtroom where the law had a face I knew intimately. The face of the woman whose heart I had bankrupted long before I ever touched a single dollar of my victim's money. The leather of my Oxfords, polished to a black mirror this morning by a man who still called me sir, made a confident squeaking sound on the courthouse's mercilessly buffed floors. It was a sound of money, a sound of importance. It was my sound. I adjusted the knot of my silk tie, the fabric cool and smooth against my throat, a small anchor of civilization in this den of bureaucratic drabness. The air itself smelled sterile, a chemical lemon scent layered over the musty perfume of old paper and older laws. My lawyer, Mark Callahan, walked beside me, his own shoes making a less assertive, more hurried sound. He was 40-something, with a face that was starting to show the strain of defending men like me. He clutched his briefcase like a life raft. "The jury's been seated," he murmured, the stale ghost of coffee on his breath. "They look receptive," I gave a small, dismissive smile. "They're a focus group, Mark. 12 people waiting to be told a story. The prosecution will give them a tragedy. We will give them a misunderstanding." I paused, placing a hand on his shoulder and feeling the fine wool of his jacket. I leaned in closer. "They have paper. I have a narrative. The jury will buy my narrative." He nodded, but his eyes darted nervously down the long, unforgiving corridor. That was the difference between us. He saw risk. I saw an audience. At 72, I had learned that reality was simply the story most people agreed to believe. My entire life was a testament to that fact. We pushed through the heavy oak doors into the courtroom. It was exactly as I had imagined, dark, solemn, and designed to make a man feel small. The paneling on the walls absorbed the light, and the fluorescent fixtures above hummed with a flat, bureaucratic buzz. I settled myself at the defendant's table, running my fingers over the wood. It was worn smooth by the hands of countless other men, guilty and innocent alike, all waiting for their story to be judged. Across the room, the prosecutor, Lena Petrova, was arranging her files. She was young, sharp, her ambition a palpable thing in the air. I'd seen her type 100 times. They believe in the paper. They believe in the rules. They always lose to the man who writes his own. The preliminaries were a blur of jargon I'd paid Callahan a fortune to understand for me. I studied the jury, a retired teacher, a mechanic, a young mother who looked exhausted. Perfect. People who understood that life is complicated, that success sometimes requires bending the rules they themselves had to live by. Petrova began her opening statement, her voice clear and earnest, painting a picture of me as a monster, a financial predator who devoured the dreams of the elderly. I listened with detached amusement. It was a decent story, full of pathos, but it lacked a compelling protagonist. Then came the moment. The side door to the chambers opened and a bailiff, a man whose chest was as broad as the doorframe, stepped forward. His voice was a low boom that seemed to shake the very dust from the air. "All rise. The court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Vance presiding." A collective rustle of fabric and scraping of chairs filled the room as everyone stood. I rose slowly, my knees protesting, my gaze fixed on the doorway. A figure in a black robe emerged, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with the stiff formality of the room. She walked toward the bench, a stack of files in her hands, her head down. It was just another faceless functionary, another cog in the machine I was about to dismantle. She placed the files on the dais, squared them perfectly, and then she looked up. Time did not slow down. It stopped. The air in my lungs turned to glass. The lemon smell vanished, replaced by the scent of lavender soap from a bathroom I hadn't seen in 3 decades. The smooth wood beneath my fingertips suddenly felt like ice. The face was older, of course, lined with the kind of wisdom and sorrow I had never allowed myself to accumulate. The hair, once a cascade of dark chestnut, was now a distinguished, elegant silver, pinned back with severe precision. But the eyes were the same, The color of a stormy sea and just as deep. The set of her jaw was the same, too. The one I'd seen 1,000 times when she'd found a discrepancy in the books. Or when she'd finally realized the stories I told were just that. Stories. The bailiff's voice echoed from a vast distance. The jury, the lawyers, the entire world dissolved into a meaningless blur. There was only the woman on the bench, looking out over the courtroom, her gaze sweeping past me as if I were just another piece of furniture, as if she didn't know me at all. A sharp, deafening crack split the silence as her gavel struck the sound block. The sound hit me like a physical blow, and a name I had not allowed myself to think, let alone speak, for 30 years formed on my lips. Ellie. The sound of the gavel lingered in the air, an aftershock that vibrated deep in my bones. My narrative, my beautiful, intricate story, had just been ripped to shreds before I'd even spoken a word. My vision narrowed to the woman on the bench, Judge Eleanor Vance. The name was a formal absurdity, a costume worn by the girl I once knew as Ellie. My hand shot out and clamped onto Callahan's forearm. My grip was surprisingly strong for a man my age. It was the desperate strength of the drowning. A recess, I hissed, my voice a dry rasp. Get a recess, now! Callahan looked at me, his professional calm finally cracking. Arthur, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, I choked out, my eyes still locked on her. She was shuffling papers, her movements economical and precise. She hadn't looked at me again. That was somehow the most terrifying part. That's Eleanor Vance. She's my ex-wife. The color drained from Callahan's face. The full catastrophic weight of the situation landed on him in an instant. Jesus, Arthur! You have got to be kidding me. He was on his feet in a second, requesting a meeting in chambers with a voice that was impressively steady, given the bomb I'd just dropped in his lap. Judge Vance granted it with a curt nod, her expression unchanging. The bailiff led the three of us, Callahan, Petrova, and me, through the side door. Every step felt like I was walking the plank. The heavy door clicked shut behind us, and the muffled sounds of the courtroom vanished. We were in her domain now. It was not the office of a vengeful woman. It was the sanctuary of a scholar of the law. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were crammed with thick legal texts, their spines forming a fortress of precedent and statute. The room smelled of old leather and wood polish, a scent far richer and more authentic than the chemical sterility of the court. On her wide mahogany desk, there was only a blotter, a pen set, and a single, silver-framed photograph turned away from view. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, muting the world outside to a distant hum. It was a place of immense quiet power, her power. She sat behind the desk, the black robe making her seem less like a person and more like an institution. She gestured for the lawyers to take the two upholstered chairs facing her. I was left to stand behind Callahan, a supplicant. My expensive suit suddenly felt tight across my shoulders, a costume for a role I no longer knew how to play. Mr. Callahan, she began, her voice calm and even. It was the same voice, but stripped of all the warmth I remembered. It was now an instrument of precision. You requested this meeting, Callahan cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor, I'm afraid we have a situation that necessitates a motion for your recusal. On what grounds? She asked, her fingers steepled before her. She didn't look at me. She addressed a point on the wall just over my lawyer's head. On the grounds? Your Honor, Callahan said, choosing his words with care, of a prior and deeply personal relationship with my client, Mr. Finch, specifically, a 30-year-old divorce that by all accounts was acrimonious. The potential for an appearance of bias, if not actual bias, is overwhelming. A fair trial under these circumstances is impossible. He laid it out perfectly, the cold legal argument for why she couldn't possibly sit in judgment of me. I watched her, searching for a flicker of something, anger, resentment, even a grim satisfaction. I saw nothing. It was like watching a statue. She let the silence hang in the room for a long moment, a heavy blanket of unspoken history. Petrova, the prosecutor, sat perfectly still. sensing that this was a drama far older than her case file. Finally, Eleanor's gaze shifted and met Callahan's. "My duty is to the law. Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "not to my past." She picked up a pen, the click as she uncapped it the only sound in the room. "I am aware of my obligations under Title 28, Section 455 of the U.S. Code. I have examined my conscience and find no basis for recusal. I can and will remain impartial." She placed the pen down with a quiet finality. "The motion is denied. This court will proceed, impartial." The word was a death sentence. The Ellie I knew would have thrown me out of this room, her face blazing with a righteous fury 30 years in the making. Vengeance I could understand. I could fight vengeance. But this cold, dispassionate creature in her place? This Judge Vance? She wasn't offering vengeance. She was offering justice. The walk back to the courtroom was the longest of my life. The verdict had already been delivered in that quiet, leather-bound room. Callahan was silent, his mind furiously recalibrating a defense that was now fundamentally broken. We took our seats. The jury filed back in, their faces a mix of curiosity and boredom, utterly unaware of the cataclysm that had just occurred. Petrova walked to the lectern, ready to call her first witness. I looked up at the bench. Eleanor, Judge Vance, was looking down, not at her notes, but at me. For the briefest fraction of a second, our eyes met. There was no hatred in them, no anger. There was nothing at all. And a terror I had never known, a cold that had nothing to do with the courtroom's air conditioning, settled deep into my marrow. She wasn't going to punish me for the past. She was going to erase it. "The prosecution calls its first witness," Lena Petrova announced, her voice ringing with a fresh, predatory confidence. "Sergeant Frank Miller." The name meant nothing to me. It was one of thousands, a line item on a spreadsheet, a fractional component of a life's work. Then the man himself shuffled forward from the public gallery, and a vague familiarity flickered. He was smaller than I remembered, shrunken by age and, I supposed, by me. He wore a tweed jacket that was probably 20 years old, the kind of garment a man keeps for weddings and funerals. On its lapel was a small faded American flag pin. His hands, knotted with arthritis, trembled slightly as he took the oath. I forced myself not to look at the bench. Not yet. I had to watch the witness, had to play the part of the concerned, wrongly accused man for the jury. But my awareness of Eleanor was a physical presence, a weight on the right side of the room. I could feel her stillness. Petrova began gently, her tone soft and respectful, the way one might speak to a revered grandfather or a spooked animal. She had him state his name, his age, 78, and his service record. 2 tours in Vietnam, a Purple Heart. He spoke in a low, unsteady voice, the kind that cracks easily. With every answer, Petrova was building a monument to his virtue, and with every stone she laid, she was digging my grave a little deeper. "Sergeant Miller," she said, moving to the heart of it. "Could you tell the court how you came to know the defendant, Mr. Finch?" My hands were sweating. I subtly wiped my palms on my trousers, my fingers tracing the fine weave of the fabric. It felt flimsy, a useless shield. "A friend at the VFW post introduced us," Miller said, his gaze drifting toward me for the first time. There was no fire in his eyes, just a vast, watery disappointment. "He said Mr. Finch was the best, a genius. Said he was building something safe, something for the long haul." I could almost hear my own voice from years ago, the smooth, confident timbre of it, the carefully chosen words. Safety, security, legacy. They were the cornerstones of the story I sold. Petrova led him through the whole sordid affair. The initial investment, his entire military pension, the glossy, fabricated account statements I sent every quarter. The phone calls where I'd patiently explained the beauty of compound interest while looking out my penthouse window at the city lights. My stomach churned, not with guilt, but with a primal fear. Every word he spoke was another nail. Through it all, I stole glances at Eleanor. Her face was a study in judicial neutrality. She watched the witness, her expression revealing nothing. When Miller's voice cracked, describing how he'd planned to use the money to help his daughter buy a house, Eleanor simply made a note on a legal pad. No flicker of sympathy, no tightening of her jaw in anger. Her control was absolute, inhuman. This was what she had become in the 30 years since I'd last seen her. A perfect, unfeeling arbiter. The thought was more chilling than any open hostility. "Objection, Your Honor," Callahan said, rising smoothly. "Relevance. Counsel is leading the witness into emotional territory not pertinent to the charges of fraud." I held my breath. Here it was, her first direct ruling on the substance of my life's undoing. "Overruled," Eleanor said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the courtroom's tension. The sound of it, so familiar and yet so foreign, sent a tremor through me. The witness may describe the impact of the financial loss. It speaks to the materiality of the defendant's alleged misrepresentations. "Proceed, Ms. Petrova." Callahan sat down, defeated. It was a sound legal ruling, textbook even, but hearing it from her mouth felt like a personal betrayal, a twisting of the knife. Petrova walked closer to the witness stand. "Sergeant Miller, you received regular statements, didn't you? Statements that showed your investment growing?" "Every 3 months," he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Like clockwork. I'd show my wife. We'd sit at the kitchen table and dream a little. It was our bedrock, you know. What he sold us," he paused, swallowing hard. "He said it was something you could build a future on. A promise." The word hung in the air. Promise. It landed in my mind like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward, distorting the present. The chalky smell of the courtroom faded, replaced by the rich, earthy scent of rain on summer asphalt. The tremor in my hands was no longer from fear, but from the ghost of a memory, a phantom sensation of another hand, smaller and warmer, held tight in mine. The polished defendant's table dissolved. I wasn't in a courtroom anymore. I was 25, standing under the awning of a closed bookstore with a girl whose eyes held more hope than the entire world was entitled to. A girl named Ellie. The world was the smell of summer rain on hot asphalt. We were 25, huddled under the faded green awning of a second-hand bookstore called the Dog-Eared Page. A sudden thunderstorm had ambushed us on our walk home from the tiny office, where I was trying to launch my first business venture, and she was meticulously keeping its books. The rain came down in thick silver sheets, drumming a frantic rhythm on the canvas above us. Ellie laughed, shaking the water from her hair. The scent of her shampoo, something clean and simple like lavender, mingled with the smell of the rain and the papery perfume wafting from the bookstore's open door. "Well," she said, her eyes sparkling, "so much for our grand 5-year plan." "Stranded and broke." "Not stranded," I corrected, pulling her closer. The fabric of her simple cotton dress was damp against my arm. "We're strategically paused." I felt like the king of the world, even in my threadbare jacket. I had $100 in the bank and this girl by my side, and it felt like an embarrassment of riches. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a folded, crinkling piece of paper. It wasn't a business plan or a stock certificate. It was a map of the state, worn at the creases. I unfolded it against the bookstore's window. "We are not broke," I announced, my voice full of a certainty I hadn't yet earned. "We are merely pre-wealthy." She leaned against my shoulder to look, a familiar smudge of blue ink on her thumb from a long day of balancing ledgers. Her practicality was the anchor to my soaring ambition, but in moments like this, she let herself be carried away with me. My finger traced a line north, past the sprawling city suburbs, up into the green-tinted wilderness of the mountains. I tapped a small sapphire blue shape. "You see this lake? Right here?" "I see it," she murmured, her breath warm against my neck. "That's where it's going to be," I said. "Our place. Not a mansion, not some gaudy palace, a cabin, made of cedar so it always smells like the woods. A big stone fireplace for the winter, and a long dock for the summer. We'll have a little boat. You'll read books on the porch and I don't know, I'll pretend to fish. She laughed again, a sound like wind chimes. You hate fishing, I'll learn. For the atmosphere, I looked from the map to her face. The hope in her eyes was so pure, so absolute, it was humbling. She believed in the stories I told. Back then I believed them too. It's going to be our bedrock, Ellie. The one real place that's all ours, no matter what happens in the city. A promise. There was that word again. Promise. But here, in my memory, it wasn't a weapon. It was a prayer. It was the foundation of the narrative I was building for both of us. A story of a future so bright it was blinding. She traced the shape of the lake on the map with her fingertip. A promise, she repeated softly. She looked up at me, and all the witty skepticism was gone, replaced by a faith that I now knew I had never deserved. It sounds like heaven, Arthur. I leaned in and kissed her, right there under the awning of the dog-eared page. The kiss tasted of rain and coffee and the infinite, terrifying, beautiful potential of the life we were just beginning to write. In that single moment, I was not a con man. I was not a fraud. I was just a young man, desperately in love, making a promise to a girl who was the whole world to him. I believed every word. I swear I did, Mr. Finch. A sharp, insistent whisper cut through the memory like a shard of glass. Mr. Finch, are you all right? The scent of rain vanished, replaced by the sterile, lemon-tinged air of the courtroom. The warmth of Ellie's hand was gone, and my own hands were gripping the cold, smooth wood of the defendant's table. The drumming of the rain was just the frantic, terrified thumping of my own heart. I blinked, my vision swimming back into focus. Callahan was leaning close, his face etched with alarm. Across the room, Lena Petrova was watching me with a hawk's intensity. And on the witness stand, Sergeant Frank Miller was no longer speaking. His face was buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The beautiful story was over. The tragedy was back on the stage. The judge called for a brief recess. Sergeant Miller was gently escorted from the courtroom, a ghost haunted by my promises. The jury filed out, their faces carefully blank, but I could feel their judgment like a change in the room's pressure. Every eye had been on me, cold and appraising, but I had felt that gaze before. Colder, more intimate, and 1,000 times more devastating. Callahan leaned over, his voice a low hiss. Arthur, you have to pull it together. You spaced out. The jury saw it. I could only nod, my throat too tight to form words, because my mind was already gone again, pulled back by the undertow of memory not to the sweet rain of my youth, but to the suffocating silence of a cold dinner 10 years later. We were in our first real house, the one with the bay windows and the grandfather clock in the hall that I'd inherited from my father. We had made it. We were living the story. A pot roast, cooked for hours until it was perfectly tender, sat on the heavy oak dining table, its rich aroma filling the air. But it was growing cold. We hadn't taken a single bite. Ellie was sitting across from me. She wasn't looking at the roast. She was looking at a book open before her. It was a simple, hardcover ledger with a blue canvas cover, the kind she used to track our household expenses with a precision that both impressed and irritated me. The only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic tock, tock, tock of the grandfather clock, each tick marking off another second of our unraveling marriage. Here, she said, her voice quiet but stripped of all its usual warmth. She tapped a line on the page with a perfectly manicured nail. The deposit from the Clarkson sale. You said it was 40,000? The bank statement shows 35. I felt a familiar, slick gear engage in my mind. The one that could spin stories, smooth over inconsistencies. That's the net after fees, Ellie. Accountants, escrow. It's complex. I tried a smile, the easy, charming one that had always worked before. Don't you worry your pretty head about it. It was the wrong thing to say. In the past, she might have let it go, trusting my narrative over her own eyes. But something had changed. She didn't look up from the ledger. And here, she continued, turning a page with a quiet, rustling sound that scraped against my nerves. This withdrawal for consulting services. 2 weeks ago. $10,000? Who did we consult, Arthur? The lie was ready on my tongue, a name, a service, a plausible fiction. But I hesitated, watching her. Her focus on that book was absolute. She wasn't angry. She was forensic. It was the first time I realized her meticulousness wasn't just a charming quirk. It was a weapon. She trusted the numbers, and the numbers were telling her a story that contradicted mine. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, the scent of the cooling pot roast suddenly cloying. I opened a crystal decanter and poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey, the clink of the stopper against the glass obscenely loud in the quiet room. The sharp alcoholic smell cut through the air. "It's a business expense," I said, my back to her. "A cost of doing business. Our business?" she asked, still in that terribly calm voice. "Or yours?" I turned around, the heavy tumbler cold in my hand. The charm was gone now, replaced by the condescension I always used as a last resort. "It's a complex world out there, Ellie. It's not as simple as your neat little columns of plus and minus. Sometimes you have to move things around, grease the wheels. You're smart, but you're naive about how things really get done." There it was. The fatal word. Naive. I saw the hurt land in her eyes. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet shuddering, a light going out. I hadn't just lied to her. I had dismissed her. I had taken her greatest strength, her integrity, her precision, and called it a weakness. In that moment, I wasn't just hiding a transaction. I was telling her she was not qualified to understand my world, the world I had promised we would build together. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply closed the blue ledger. The soft thump of the cover hitting the page was the sound of a door closing between us, one that would never reopen. She looked at me, her husband, the man whose dreams she had underwritten with her faith, and for the first time, she saw a stranger. The prosecution would like to enter into evidence. Petrova's voice sliced through the decades, yanking me back to the present. Callahan was nudging me, trying to get my attention about the next exhibit. I looked up, my blood running cold. Lena Petrova was standing before the court clerk, and in her gloved hands, she held a ledger. It wasn't the same one from our dining room, of course. This one was larger, thicker, its cover a different shade of blue. But it might as well have been. I looked from the book in her hands to the woman on the bench. Of all the documents, all the paper they had on me, this was the one I feared most. Not because of the numbers hidden inside it, but because the woman sitting in judgment was the one who had taught me that a simple ledger, in the right hands, could be a murder weapon. The air in the courtroom grew thin and dry as Lena Petrova called her next witness, a forensic accountant from the IRS. He was a small, neat man with glasses, and he spoke about the blue ledger with a passionless precision that was more damning than any fiery accusation. He was the narrator of my downfall, and he read the story written in my own secret language of numbers. He walked the jury through the tangled web of shell corporations, phantom invoices, and rerouted funds. It was a masterpiece in its own way, a complex, self-sustaining ecosystem of deceit I had cultivated for decades. Listening to him dissect it felt strangely distant, like hearing an academic critique of a novel I'd written long ago. The numbers were just numbers. The names of the companies were just names. Callahan fought back, objecting where he could, muddying the waters with questions about accounting standards and interpretive ambiguity. I felt a flicker of my old confidence return. This was my territory, a battle of narratives, the state's story of cold, hard numbers versus my story of complex, aggressive, but ultimately legitimate business. Then Petrova walked to her table and picked up a clear plastic sleeve containing a single yellow document. The dry, dusty smell of old evidence files seemed to intensify as she approached the witness. "Mr. Hest," she said, "I'm showing you what's been marked as Prosecution Exhibit 42B. Can you identify it?" The document was placed on the overhead projector. An image of the old, brittle paper filled the screen for the jury to see. It was a property deed. The accountant adjusted his glasses. Yes, this is a deed for a parcel of land in Marquette County, purchased by a holding company named Bedrock Enterprises, LLC. Bedrock. My own private cynical joke, the word Sergeant Miller had used. The word I had whispered to Ellie under a bookstore awning. My collar suddenly felt too tight, a starched garrote slowly constricting my airway. Petrova let the name hang in the air for a moment before continuing. And can you trace the funds used to purchase this property? Yes, Hest replied, consulting the ledger. The funds were diverted from the accounts of at least 20 different investors, including the previous witness, Mr. Miller. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. I felt pinned to my chair, the hard wood pressing into my spine. I stared at the projected image of the deed, at the map of the plot of land. It was a waterfront property, on a small sapphire blue lake. The lake, my phantom cabin, the home of a promise I never intended to keep. But the final blow had yet to fall. And what was the purpose of this holding company, Bedrock Enterprises? Petrova asked. It was used to secure a line of credit, Hest said. A loan using this fraudulently obtained property as collateral. And who, Petrova asked, her voice dropping, authorized this transaction on behalf of the company? She produced another document, a loan application. She placed it on the projector, her hand pointing to a signature at the bottom. The ink was a faded blue, the handwriting a familiar, elegant cursive. Eleanor Vance Finch. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. I could hear a high-pitched ringing in my own ears. I remembered the moment with a clarity that felt like a physical impact. It was years after the fight over the blue ledger, during a brief false spring in our dying marriage. I'd slid a stack of papers across the same oak dining table. Just some routine incorporation stuff for a new venture, Ellie, I'd said with my most reassuring smile. My lawyer says we need your signature here as a board member. She had hesitated, then signed. She still wanted to believe in the story. I had counted on it. I had used the last dregs of her trust to make her an unwitting accomplice. In that dead silence, a force beyond my control made me lift my head and look at the bench. Eleanor was already looking at me. The judicial mask was gone. For one breathtaking, terrifying second, I saw her. Not the judge. Not the statue. I saw Ellie, her face a canvas of 30-year-old pain. There was no anger. It was something far worse. It was memory. In her eyes, I saw the reflection of the young woman at the dining table, the lakeside promise, and the final, devastating betrayal of her signature. It was a silent, wretched acknowledgement that passed between us, a shared truth that annihilated every lie I had ever told. She knew. She remembered everything. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask was back. Her face was impassive stone. Her gaze dropped to her notes. The moment was over, but it had been enough. My confidence didn't just shatter. It evaporated. It had never really existed. It was just a story I told myself. Callahan was whispering furiously in my ear. We can fight this, Arthur. We'll say she signed it willingly, that she was complicit. His words were meaningless static. The legal game was over. The paper trail had not just led to a crime. It had led back to my soul, and she had seen it. There was only one narrative left, one final, desperate play. I couldn't convince the jury. I had to convince her. I had to take the stand. I had to make her look at me again and see not the defendant, not the monster from the headlines, but the boy she once loved under the awning in the rain. It's suicide, Arthur. Callahan's whisper was raw with desperation during the recess. We were huddled in the small conference room, the air thick with the smell of his anxious, mint-scented breath. Petrova will tear you to pieces. We have a strategy. We're creating doubt. Don't throw it all away. The strategy is dead, I said, my voice eerily calm. It died when she put that deed on the screen. The jury isn't listening to you anymore, Mark. They're watching a play, and she's the only one in the audience who matters. You can't appeal to her, he insisted, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time. She is a federal judge. It's not a conversation. It's testimony. Under oath. It's the only move I have left, I said, looking past him, my gaze fixed on the wall. I have to talk to her. He saw the foolish, unbending resolve in my eyes, and his shoulders slumped. He knew he had lost. The walk from the defendant's table to the witness stand felt like a mile. Every eye in the room followed me, 100 pairs of tiny needles on my skin. The space was cramped, walled in by dark wood and smelling faintly of disinfectant and old, musty paper. I placed my left hand on the worn Bible, its cover cool and unnervingly smooth, and raised my right. The words of the oath were ashes in my mouth. I sat down. The chair squeaked. The microphone was a cold metal eye staring at me, and directly in my line of sight, enthroned, was Eleanor. Callahan began, leading me gently through our rehearsed narrative. My early life, my ambitions, the creation of my firm. My voice was steady, my tone regretful. I spoke of market forces beyond my control, of ambitious ventures that failed, of a desire to create wealth for others that spiraled into a tragedy of miscalculation. It was a good story, plausible, human. I wasn't a criminal. I was a tragic hero. Throughout my performance, I angled my body slightly, directing my words not to the jury, but to her. I was speaking to Ellie, reminding her of the dreamer she had once loved. I felt a sliver of my old power return. I was spinning the narrative, and it felt good. When Callahan was finished, I felt a cautious optimism. I had laid the groundwork. I had reminded her of the man, not the monster. Then Lena Petrova stood up, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. She approached the lectern, her movements economical and sharp. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice devoid of any emotion, "you've painted a picture of an unfortunate businessman. Let's talk about some of your investors. You knew many of them personally, did you not?" "I tried to maintain a personal relationship with all my clients," I said smoothly. "A personal relationship." "I see," she consulted her notes. "You remember David Chen, don't you, Mr. Finch? He and his wife used to come over for dinner. A family friend, I believe." My blood turned to ice. David was a friend from the old neighborhood. Ellie had been fond of his wife. "Yes, I remember David," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "And you remember that Mr. Chen invested his entire retirement fund with you?" I remember he was an investor, yes. It was a tragedy what happened to his portfolio." "Indeed," Petrova said, her voice like chipping stone. "Did you personally solicit that investment from him, Mr. Finch?" Here was the trap. I saw it instantly. Admitting it would make me look like a predator who targeted his friends. Denying it was safer. "My associates handled the bulk of the new accounts by that point," I said, forcing a pained expression. "I was focused on market strategy. I wasn't directly involved in his account, but I always regretted his losses deeply. It was a good lie. It sounded plausible. It showed remorse while shifting blame. I glanced at the jury. They seemed to be buying it. Petrova stared at me for a long, silent beat. "You weren't directly involved." "No," I said, more confidently this time. She turned to her table. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to enter into evidence Prosecution Exhibit 74A. The clerk took the document from her. It was a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the overhead projector. My own handwriting, bold and familiar, filled the screen. It was a personal letter. "To David. And I know you're nervous, Dave," the projection read. "But this is me, Arthur. I'm personally guaranteeing this. Think of it as our ticket to the good life, just like we talked about on the golf course. You and me, old friend. You have my word." A collective gasp went through the gallery. The jury stared, their faces masks of open contempt. The lie was exposed, naked and ugly under the fluorescent lights. My entire narrative, my entire performance had been annihilated by a single sheet of paper. My gaze shot to Callahan. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring down at his legal pad, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he placed his forehead in his hands. the sound in the courtroom ceased to exist. There was only a roaring in my ears. I did the only thing I had left to do. I lifted my eyes to the bench, a drowning man searching for a lifeline in the storm. My appeal was no longer legal or theatrical. It was a silent, desperate scream across 30 years. Ellie, please. But the woman who looked back wasn't Ellie. Her face was perfectly still, devoid of triumph or pity or even recognition. She was justice itself, robed in black, blind and deaf to my pathetic dying story. She was waiting patiently for the proceedings to continue, and in her perfect, terrible stillness, I finally heard the verdict. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. 2 hours to deliberate on 30 years of lies. When they filed back in, their faces were grim and set. They refused to look at me. In that moment I knew. The rest was just ceremony. The foreman, a tired-looking man who worked as a mechanic, stood with a piece of paper that trembled in his hand. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the same sound that had buzzed with indifference on the first day. On the charge of wire fraud, the foreman read, his voice cracking on the first word, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The word did not land like a bomb. It landed like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin. On the charge of mail fraud, guilty. On the charge of securities fraud, guilty. On the charge of money laundering, guilty. With every word, another lock clicked shut. I watched the victims in the gallery. Some wept quietly into tissues. Sergeant Miller simply closed his eyes, his head bowed. Callahan laid a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of commiseration that felt like it came from a mile away. I felt nothing. The man who had walked into this courtroom convinced he could rewrite reality was already gone. I was just a shell waiting for the inevitable. 2 weeks later, I stood before her for the last time. The fine wool of my suit was gone, replaced by the coarse, scratchy fabric of an orange prison jumpsuit. The click and slide of my polished Oxfords was gone, replaced by the soft, shuffling sound of rubber-soled slip-ons. The confident man was gone, replaced by federal inmate Yummer 734. The reversal was complete. When the moment came, Judge Vance asked the question, Mr. Finch, is there anything you wish to say before this court imposes its sentence? This was it. My last performance, but the stage was gone, the audience was gone, and the script was ashes. All that was left was the truth. I rose, the chains between my wrist cuffs making a soft, metallic sound. I didn't look at the jury or the gallery. I looked at her. Your Honor, I began, my voice a stranger's rasp. Then I stopped. The formality was another lie, and I was done with lies. Eleanor, I said, the name feeling foreign and sacred on my tongue. 30 years ago, more now, we were standing under the awning of a bookstore in the rain. I was showing you a map, a story about the future. I saw a flicker in her eyes, the barest acknowledgement. Later, I continued, in our home, you found a flaw in another story. A small number in a blue ledger that didn't add up. You told me the truth and I called you naive. My voice finally broke. I should have listened to you then. Everything, all of this, it's because I didn't. I am sorry. For that, more than anything, I sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Eleanor let the silence sit for a long moment, a final testament to the weight of everything unsaid between us. When she spoke, her voice was not directed at me, but at the court, at the law itself. She never used my first name again. Trust, she said, her voice clear and resonant, is the currency of our society. It is the foundation of our markets, our government, and our system of justice. It is the bedrock upon which people build their lives. Mr. Finch, you did not just steal money. You did not just bankrupt families. You bankrupted the faith of every person who believed your story. There is no restitution for that. There is only the consequence. She looked directly at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a judge or an ex-wife. I saw a surgeon preparing to cut away a cancer. It wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of grim, necessary healing. This court sentences you, Arthur Finch, to 25 years to life in federal prison. The number was an abyss, a void that swallowed the handful of years I had left. The marshals moved in, their hands firm on my arms. They pulled me back, away from the table, away from the world. The handcuffs bit into my wrists, cold and final. I took one last look back. She was still on the bench, a solitary figure robed in black, watching as the consequences were carried out. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind me with a deep, final thud. Years have passed. The seasons turn outside the concrete walls, but in here, time is measured in bells and head counts. I am an old man now, my charm worn away to bone and regret. My narrative is over. I spend most days in the prison library. Sometimes I think of her. I used to imagine her tending a garden, at peace. But that's a story, and I am finished with them. I know only what I know. On the worst nights, I remember her face on that final day. I used to think it was the face of justice, cold and implacable. But I was wrong. It was the face of mercy. Not the mercy of a lighter sentence, but the mercy of a true ending. She did not give me vengeance. She did not give me pity. She gave me the one thing I had spent my entire life trying to escape. A fact. A consequence that could not be spun or sold or renegotiated. I began this thinking they had paper, and I had a narrative. In the end, the paper was the only truth that mattered.